We can go ahead and get started here. All right. Let's see. I guess before we start, are there any questions about anything from last time? No? Okay. All right. Well, in that case, we'll go ahead and start chapter 5. So this is basically, you know, an extension of chapter 4. Uh, but now we're looking, instead of looking at the theory, now we're going to be looking at the evidence, right? What evidence exists to support the theories, right? So, of course, last time in chapter 4, we learned about the conceptual framework, thinking about the demand for medical care. Um, so, just to recap a little bit, um, we saw in chapter 4 that at least theoretically, quantity demanded depends on lots of things. Um, Price, not surprisingly, but also illness severity, generosity of insurance coverage, cost of time and the time needed for care, and age, among perhaps other things, even. Um, and of course, we get the usual result that income and medical care are directly related, right? Medical care is a normal good. Um, and we also saw that responses to price changes in two separate healthcare services will depend on whether they are substitutes or complements, right? So that question of complementarity or substitutability. But all of that was theoretical, right? Um, the real question is, does the model make good predictions in the sense that uh, it can predict what we observe in real life, right? So empirically, is the theory supported, right? So that's what we're going to look at today are some studies of how medical care use and the factors above actually affect demand, right? All right, so your learning goals for this chapter. Number one, being able to understand the distinction between model and evidence. So hopefully you guys already have a good idea of the difference there. But what we did last time was modeling. What we're looking at today is evidence, right? Number two, be able to have at least a general understanding of the magnitude of demand elasticities for medical care of various types. So we'll see that. Understanding how specific variables affect demand for medical care and how cross-price elasticities can matter. Excuse me. And then lastly, be able to apply consumer demand models and evidence to be able to measure the economic importance of variations in medical practice, right? So we saw last time, what was it, chapter 3, I think, that there's a lot of variation in how medicine is practiced, right? So looking at the importance of that regarding consumer demand and what evidence exists regarding that variation. All right, so just to start off, we're going to talk about some of the studies that have looked at demand curves. So there were numerous studies, primarily in the 1970s, that tried to estimate demand curves, but the results were pretty widely varied. So there was a lot of variance in the results that were being reported. So just as an example of the large differences that sort of existed, some estimates on the price elasticities for hospital days ranged from negative 0.67 in one study by Phelps to negative 0.47 in another study by Davis and Russell just a year later, all the way down to 0 for some specific illnesses, and that was in a study done by Rosenthal. Um, First of all, I want to make sure we're all on the same page here and we all understand how to interpret these elasticities. Okay, so can anybody tell me what an elasticity, a price elasticity of 0.67 means, or negative 0.67? Anybody? Okay, so let's make sure we understand how to interpret elasticities, right? So what 0.67 means is that for a 1% increase in price, there is a 0.67% decrease in quantity demanded. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that these price elasticities are in the inelastic range, right? So if you'll hopefully recall from your principles class or your intermediate micro class, an elasticity between 0 and 1 means that we have inelastic demand in this case. So there's not a very large response in quantity demanded compared to the change in price, right? The change in quantity demanded is smaller than the change in price in percent terms. If the elasticity was greater than 1, ignoring the negative, of course, if it's greater than 1, then the response in quantity demanded is large compared to price, right? So an elasticity of -2 would mean that the response in quantity demanded is twice as large as the response, or twice as large as the change in price. So if there's a 1% increase in price, there'd be a 2% decrease in quantity demanded if the elasticity was -2. Okay. And of course, an elasticity of 0 means there's no response, right? Perfectly inelastic, in other words, right? A demand curve up and down, in other words. Okay, so again, if remembering elasticities, what they mean, there's a section in chapter 4 that goes over elasticities that you might want to look at. Okay. Just to give you some more examples of the wide variance in results, a few studies looked at price elasticities for physician care and found that they can range from anywhere from -0.14, which is a very low responsiveness, all the way up to 1, which is pretty much, if you remember, that's unit elastic. When elasticity is 1, we call that unit elastic, unit meaning 1. So pretty wide range there. And then one study looked at or estimated an overall price elasticity of demand for all medical care and found that it was as large as -1.5. So there, we're in the elastic range, right? So very responsive, a very high response to change in price, right? But unfortunately, for these early studies, they all suffered from various statistical complications. So some of them, basically none of them were controlled experiments. In a nutshell, that's what they were lacking, was that none of them were controlled experiments. Some of them were quote unquote natural experiments, so they were a bit stronger than the ones that weren't natural experiments, but still they lacked the sort of control that we would like, the sort of control that we get in RCTs, right? Randomized control trials. But they did agree on one thing, and that is the broad conclusion that price matters, right? Which isn't surprising. That should not be a surprise, right? Price matters in all kinds of things, so that should not be surprising. So, but that's a pretty weak result, right? That's if you told me that, well, price matters when people make choices regarding medical care use, I'd be like, well, duh, I don't think you would have to take any economics to understand that. So unfortunately, not very strong results here. And on top of that, the results are kind of all over the place. So it's like, I don't know, we can't really what can we really do with these results? There's not a lot we can do. Um, but then, of course, we had the Rand health insurance study that we talked about earlier, and and this was actually launched in part because of the statistical issues regarding these other studies. And recall that this was a random control trial, so a randomized experiment, which means it alleviates all the problems associated with the other studies. It's able to get around the statistical issues because of its design, the fact that it's an RCT, and so the fact that there was a large sample size and there was randomization of treatment gives us sort of the best estimates that exist. Okay. Um, Even decades later, there really hasn't been anything done like this since. Well, there have been a few things done that are similar, but this was like kind of the broadest and biggest study, and so even today, these are really strong results, even today, which is good. That's great. Um, so just to remind you some of the details of that study, there were almost 6,000 people enrolled in the study, from four major urban areas and then two rural sites. So the urban areas were Dayton, Ohio, Seattle, Washington, Charleston, South Carolina, and Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and then two rural sites, one in South Carolina and one in Massachusetts. So hopefully you can kind of see, maybe why these sites were chosen, right? You've got a place that's on the West Coast, maybe more liberal in some ways. You've got Dayton, Ohio, which is kind of more or less in the heart of the country. You've got South Carolina, so kind of sort of representing the South, and then Massachusetts, and then these rural sites are in states where they also had an urban area, right? So that we could make a comparison between people that live in rural areas and people that live in urban areas within the same state, so that hopefully they're pretty similar, except for the fact that you know, one is rural, the other's urban. And we already talked about this, but just to recap, participants were asked to participate for either 3 or 5 years, and they had to give up any existing health insurance that they already had. So they had to give that up and go with whatever they were given in the study. And in terms of person years, there was over 20,000 person years of data, and everybody in the study was under 65, and nobody was institutionalized. So nobody was in prison or in a mental health facility or anything like that. And they were randomly assigned to an insurance plan, completely randomly. And so as far as the different plans that were randomly assigned, there was a full coverage group, so zero copay, zero co-insurance rate. There was a group that had a co-insurance rate of 25% for all services. There was a group that was the 50% copayment for all services. And then there was another group that was a 50% copayment for dental and medical services, but 25% copayment for all other medical services. So it acts as a treatment to look at differences between difference in mental and dental. So we can compare. Let me pause my video. So we can compare this group to the second group, basically, right? Because the second and fourth group are the same in all ways except for the dental and mental services. So that's actually a typo there. That should be dental and mental, not medical. So I'll fix that when I post the slides. And then there was another group where they basically had full coverage, except for they had a deductible for ambulatory care. So we can compare this group to the first group, and the only difference is this deductible. And then the last group was actually several groups, but there was a group where there was no coverage until a catastrophic cap was reached. And there were several subgroups within this group. So there was a group within this group where the cap was 5% of family income, another that was 10% of family income, and 15% of family income, subject to an overall max of $1,000. Okay, so this is looking at sort of just trying to get at a sense of people not being covered, right? And this last plan coverage wasn't technically no coverage. It was actually a 5% coverage, so a co-insurance rate of 95%. And the reason for that was to incentivize filing claims, because the way that the data was collected was through claims. And if there was no coverage, then people might not basically file a claim, right? In fact, there wouldn't be any incentive to file a claim if there was zero coverage. And we need those claims in order to get the data. So it technically wasn't zero coverage. It was just very, very low coverage. Okay. And then just as a side note, separately, some individuals were enrolled in a health maintenance organization, or HMO, in the city of Seattle. But we're going to discuss those. We're going to discuss that group in Chapter 11 when we look at insurance supply and managed care. We won't look at that group at all in this chapter. Now, some other important details. So all of these plans had a cap on financial risk, the same way that was implemented in the zero coverage plan, right? The last plan that we looked at. So all plans had a cap on financial risk, and they all worked the same way as the catastrophic plan. So all plans had a cap where if expenses reached this cap, any expenses beyond that cap were fully covered. Okay, and it worked the same way. It was either 5, 10, or 15% of family income up to a max of $1,000. And so, like I said, in the event that families surpassed this cap, they received full coverage for any remaining expenses for the rest of the year. But you should keep in mind that families with lower coinsurance rates are less likely to reach this cap. So basically, this cap did not affect the full coverage group, right? The group that had zero coinsurance would never reach the cap because they never pay anything, right? The insurance covers it all. So, but even the group with 25% coinsurance, it was much less likely that they would reach this threshold, simply because they have more coverage. Now, the cap provided an incentive to enroll, right? So it limited the losses to a family, so that provides an incentive to enroll. And on top of that, a participation incentive was provided. So families were actually paid money in the amount equal to the maximum risk that they faced. Okay, so they were essentially compensated. So if they did reach that cap, this payment would fully cover it. And basically what that ensured is that no one would possibly be made worse off by participating. There was no way to be made worse off. You could only be made better off by participating. And so in addition to incentivizing people to participate, it also helped to eliminate enrollment refusals and attrition. And what that means, what the enrollment refusal means, is that someone might say, yeah, I'll participate, and then they're randomly assigned to a group, and some people are going to be randomly assigned to the no coverage group, right? Well, at that point, somebody might be like, well, no, I'm not going to participate if that's the group that I'm in, right? So it helped eliminate that type of enrollment refusal. And then attrition is when people drop out of the study, right? Because you can't really force people. You can't coerce people into participating, right? And attrition is when people drop out early. And so it eliminated it helped eliminate that attrition as well. Um, and so it had a lot of benefits, right? This payment had a lot of benefits, but it did complicate the analysis to a small degree, but it was obviously worth the complication. Okay, so that's the details of the health insurance study that are important to know. But now we're going to start looking at results, the results of the study. All right, so just some specifics about the results. The primary results basically are just comparing averages across the plans. So just looking at simple averages between each plan type. So that's the basic results. But then the experimenters also ran regressions in order to control for other factors like age and income and gender. So that allows us to control for those things. It also allows us to show the effects of those variables of interest, such as age or income or whatever, right? So those results also exist, and the basic results are in Table 5.1, and they show us uh, some results for outpatient care as well as total medical care spending. Um, and then Table 5.2 basically takes this same data, but it converts it into arc elasticities, which if you want more information on how arc elasticities work, you can see box 5.1. And I don't know what you guys learned in your principles class. If you know, sometimes we cover elasticities in principles, sometimes we don't. It just depends on the school or the program. Hopefully, you covered elasticities. Um, and then, if you did cover elasticities, there's basically two different ways to calculate them. Um, and it's becoming more and more common to just use arc elasticities. So you can think of arc elasticities as an average elasticity. Um, and again, I'm not going to go over the details too much here, but basically, arc elasticities are particularly useful when you only have 2 points of data rather than an entire demand curve. Okay, so two prices and two quantities demanded associated with those prices allows you to calculate an arc elasticity. Um, when I teach micro, the only way I teach elasticities is arc elasticities. I don't even bother with the old way of doing it because it's just becoming more and more common to use arc elasticities. But again, if you want the specifics, take a look at box 5.1. Okay, so let's look at some of the basic results here. So let's just start with the leftmost column, face-to-face visits. And then as you can see, the plans are sort of decreasing, right? It's from most generous to least generous. And then there's the individual deductible kind of separately. But just face-to-face visits, we can see something that makes a lot of intuitive sense. The cheaper it is to go see a doctor, the more visits a patient would have, right? So for the free plan, the average number of face-to-face visits was 4.5. When the coinsurance rate increased to 25%, that number of visits decreased to 3.3 visits. It decreased only slightly when the coinsurance rate increased to 50%. And then the no coverage group had the least number of face-to-face visits, but the decrease was still pretty slight, going from 50% to 95% coverage. And then you can see that the individual deductible, 3.02%, is not much different from the 50% coinsurance rate. Right. Oh yeah, and then just so you know, the number that's in parentheses below the result is the standard error. Okay, so it's the amount of error in the estimate, um, but it's low enough so that these are statistically significant, which is good. These numbers actually have statistical meaning. The error is low enough, so the estimate is precise enough to have meaning. And we see, pretty much the same patterns in other categories, right? So outpatient expenses get smaller as the insurance gets less generous. The number of hospital admissions goes down. The number of inpatient dollars goes down as the plans get less generous. Okay. Um, and then there's a couple of interesting columns here: probabilities of any medical expenditures, probability of any inpatient expenditures. Those are also decreasing with generosity, as generosity decreases. We can see the same pattern with total expenses and adjusted total expenses. So I'm not sure what the adjustment is. Uh, yeah, I'm not sure what the adjustment that they made was. Let me see if I can find it in the text here. Yeah, I can't seem to remember what that was, but in any case, we see the same pattern, right? Expenditures go down uh, as the generosity of the insurance decreases. All right, but these are very basic results, right? And they shouldn't be surprising, right? As people have to pay more out of pocket, they utilize medical care less, and so the expenditures are less, the number of visits are fewer, and so on. But we can take this data and convert it into some arc elasticities. So that's what we see here. And I think you can pretty much ignore the second column. I'm not entirely sure what that even means. I guess they're looking at the average coinsurance rate, but I would just focus on the leftmost column. So the range of nominal coinsurance variation. So really, this is split into two groups. So the group that has uh, full or nearly full coverage, and then the group that has less coverage or almost no coverage. And so we can look at the elasticities for all care, and what we see is that the group where there's almost full coverage or full coverage, the response is lower, right? So the response to a price change is lower than the group that has to pay more out of pocket, which makes sense, right? If you have full coverage, you don't care what happens to price because you don't have to pay anything out of pocket. So why would you respond at all to price changes, right? Whereas if you're paying more out of pocket, this group that's 25 to 95% coinsurance, there's going to be slightly more response, right? Because you're having to pay a larger fraction of the expenses out of pocket. And then we see the same pattern for outpatient care, right? Those with more coverage are less responsive to price changes. Okay. So far, while this information is useful, it shouldn't be surprising, right? This is exactly what theory predicts, right? So no surprise here. Um, Now, there was a study about a decade later that used the same data, but it broke down price responsiveness into two components. Um, One component was related to the number of episodes, and the other component was spending per episode. And they did this using an episode of illness analysis, which basically means that, like, you could think of it as incidence, right? Like the incidence of illness. And this data, these results are shown in table 5.3. And the nice thing about these results is that they were broken down by the type of care received, which gives us some more detail. And overall, it was found in this study by Keeler et al. That if the responsiveness to price changes is still fairly small, but they found larger responses um, than the simple comparison of the averages that we just saw. So still small responses. So we're talking, elasticities in the range of 0 to 1, so inelastic response, um, but somewhat larger than what we just saw. And the nice thing about the results here is that they correspond with intuition about medical necessity, right? So um, things like heart transplants are going to have a very low elasticity, right? Very close to zero, compared to something like a primary care visit, right? For a physical or something, right? Um, Things that have a higher medical necessity are going to have lower elasticities, right? Lower responsiveness to price changes. All right, so here's the results of that study. So again, we're breaking it into the groups for um, high to full coverage and low coverage. And again, we see the same pattern, right? So lower responsiveness to price changes for those that have higher coverage compared to those that have lower coverage. And that's true for all of these categories, right? We see lower responsiveness compared to the lower coverage group, except for here. So there is one exception, and that's right here with hospital visits. So we'll talk about why that might be the case in a second. Um, but we can also look at differences between, say, acute and chronic illness, right? So there's a lower response. So this is actually interesting. So looking at acute and chronic illness, there's a lower response for acute illness for those that have high levels of coverage, but the opposite is true for those that have low levels of coverage. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. Um, what would possibly be happening there? Not exactly sure, but it has something to do with the fact that chronic illness is an illness that happens repeatedly, right? It's something like diabetes. You can't get rid of diabetes, right? Whereas an acute illness kind of happens once and then you're over it, right? So there's something going on there that I'm not entirely sure about. I'll have to think about that more, why that difference might be there. But and then this one is like wellness checks. So this would be like physicals and things like that. Preventive care. That's what wellness care is. Let's see. Is there anything else interesting to point out here? Oh yeah. So something else that's really interesting is the huge change in terms of dental care. So for those that have nearly full coverage, very low responsiveness to price changes, and then those that have less coverage, there's a much higher responsiveness to price changes. Um, and so, that probably has to do again with medical necessity, right? For those that have almost full coverage, it's nearly free. So yeah, go get the dental care, regardless of how the price of it might change. But for those that have lower coverage, lower insurance coverage, dental care, it'd be nice to have, but it's not as necessary as, say, a hospital visit or something like that. So I think that's why we see such a large increase in the responsiveness for dental care, is because it's not really a medical necessity, right? It's more of a luxury. Um, let's see here. So let's talk about. Let's see. Yeah. So let's talk about why there might be such a difference here in hospital care, right? Hospital visits. Why would the people that have less coverage be less responsive? So this is the only one where the result is sort of opposite. And that, there's, a number of reasons why that might be. Well, one thing to note here is that the error here on this one is quite large compared to the other errors. You can see that it's at least double some of these other errors. So that might be part of the reason of what's going on here. This estimate isn't as precise, and so it could be that these are actually the same, right? Um, because this has such a large error. So that might be something that's going on, and why we see the reversal. But it could also be that it could have to do with um, basically the medical necessity, um, and it also could be, honestly, the probably the best hypothesis here is that hospital visits are typically the result of emergencies or really poor care in terms of health. So it could be that these people with high coverage are engaging in more wellness, right? So they're going and getting physicals and routine checkups and engaging in preventive care, which would lead to uh, uh, less of a need for hospital visits, right? For these people, if they're taking better care of themselves because they're fully covered or nearly fully covered, um, then then hospital visits aren't going to be as much of a medical necessity. Whereas these people that are less covered, they're not going to be able to engage in as much wellness care, and so they might have to visit the hospital more frequently. So I think that that might be what's going on here. But again, we kind of have to take that result with a grain of salt because of this large error or larger error. So just keep that in mind. So in addition to sort of this study breaking out the results into finer detail, it also estimated the expenses for persons with a number of plans, um, including, let's see, did I do this right? Yeah, a number of plans, including no insurance, even though such plans didn't exist in the study. So it basically did a simulation. Um, and so what it found was that uninsured persons under 65 are predicted to spend almost $2,000 per year. And that's in 2010 dollars. While fully insured persons under 65 were predicted to spend almost $3,500 per year, which is a 75% increase. So those that had full coverage spent about 75% more than those that were uninsured, which again is not surprising, right? That's the theoretical prediction. People with more coverage will spend more on healthcare. Okay. Any questions so far about anything? So those are kind of the basic results, but there's a lot more to look at from this study. So one of the things that we can look at is are hospital and outpatient care substitutes or complements. And so this was actually a specific design aspect of the health insurance study. There was one aspect of it that was designed specifically to answer this question, and that was um, the ambulatory care deductible that we mentioned, right? So there was that one group that had a $150 individual deductible for ambulatory care. And just so we're clear on what ambulatory care is, that's also another term for it is outpatient care. So care received outside of a hospital. So this could be a primary care physician um, or something like that, right? It also includes emergency room visits, but um, which is kind of confusing because usually emergency rooms are in a hospital. But anyway, um, outpatient care, right? And so the deductible applied only to ambulatory care. The enrollees had full coverage for hospital care. So basically, this group was exactly the same as the full coverage group, except for that they had this deductible, right? So any differences in hospital use between this group and the full coverage group can answer this question. And the results of this particular aspect of the study are shown in table 5.4. All right, so let's take a look at that. Okay, so we've got admissions per year and inpatient cost. And as we can see, the general result is that as insurance generosity decreases, so does use, right? So admissions go down as insurance coverage goes down. So that's the typical result we should see. And the same thing with costs, right? Except for, well, this is interesting. So costs were actually the most for this group. So I'm not exactly sure why that is. Looks like your book doesn't mention why. So that's interesting. I'd be curious why that cost right there is the highest. I would expect this group to have the highest cost and then for costs to decrease from there. But really the main point that we want to think about is comparing this group to the group with $150 deductible, because these two groups were the same, except for this group had the deductible, this group did not have the deductible. And what we can see is that there was a slightly lower rate of admission for the group with deductibles, and the cost was lower. And that's what we should expect. But the question is, are these things complements or substitutes? Well, the results tell us that these things are complements, right? The price of admission, the price of ambulatory care, right? So outpatient care went up. Let me start my video again. Hopefully my internet is stable. Right, so the price of ambulatory care went up, and basically what we're seeing is that the demand for inpatient care went down. Okay, and that indicates that those are complements, right? All right, so that's our answer, right? Ambulatory care and hospital care seem to be complements. All right, any questions about that? Okay, let's keep going here. All right, so another aspect of the health insurance study looked specifically at dental care, which is really nice because even today, a lot of health insurance doesn't include dental or vision, but the health insurance study wanted to look at dental care in particular. So it allows us to look at elasticities of other services, including dental care, but also medical care, as well as emergency room care. And there were a few studies before this that looked at dental care, but they faced a lot of the same issues as those other studies we looked at in terms of statistical reliability. So that the results were kind of shaky at best. But all of them did indicate a higher degree of responsiveness than for other medical services. So a higher elasticity. And the health insurance study actually confirmed this result, at least partially. So that's good. So even though the results were shaky, it seems like that they were on the right track, given what was found in the health insurance study. And those results are in table 5.5. So let's look at that. All right. So, and the interesting thing here too is there's going to be a time aspect that we're going to talk about here. So we're looking at year 1 and year 2 in the plan or in the study, and then we're looking at non-dental versus dental expenditures among the different groups. And so keep in mind that there was that one group where the dental care and mental care was had a co-insurance rate of 50%, but everything else was 25%. And so we can actually compare these two groups right here to look at the difference in dental care coverage, right? So that's what we're going to do is really compare these two groups. But first, let's look at sort of the overall patterns. So again, not surprisingly, non-dental expenditures decrease as generosity decreases. And it's the same with dental. And that's true whether we're looking at year one or year two, right? Decreases in expenditure. Okay. Except for right here. That's an interesting point. But so we see the same general pattern that we have been seeing. But again, we want to kind of focus in on these two groups, right? So not surprisingly, there's really no difference in spending between these groups in non-dental expenditure, right? In fact, we should see the same or basically the same level of expenditure. And we do. And unfortunately, the errors aren't reported here, but these are basically the same number, and these probably are too, right? 128 and 122, those are probably essentially statistically the same. But where the huge differences are in dental spending, right? So obviously, now this is interesting. So we would expect, I think, prima facie, that the group that has to pay more for dental work would spend less, but they actually spend more. So that's kind of interesting. But that's only true in year one. In year two, that's not the case. So the question, hopefully you're thinking, well, why? What's going on here? And the hypothesis that the authors put forward is that in year one, there's a lot of dental coverage, there's a lot of dental expense because dental care can kind of be stocked up, so to speak, right? So, and you have to keep in mind that probably most of these people that participated, they probably did not have dental coverage in whatever health insurance they had before the study. So when they all of a sudden have it, they have some level of dental coverage. They're like, oh crap, I'm gonna go get my teeth cleaned and get some oral surgery because now I'm covered, right? But once that takes place, you don't really need that in later years, right? And so that's probably what's accounting for the fact that there's a drop in dental care expenditure. In fact, it's basically cut in half from year one to year two here. Um, I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. Why this group that had to pay more for dental coverage spent more on dental coverage. Let's see if your book mentions anything about that. Yeah, so it doesn't look like your book addresses this, but that's something that's interesting, right? And again, it might be partially due to the fact that we don't see errors reported here, and so maybe statistically speaking, these are almost the same number. Um, but I would expect that this would be higher than this one because this group only had to pay for 25% of their dental care, while this group had to pay for 50%. So I'm a bit confused as to why that result happened, and your book doesn't seem to address why. So, um, but in any case, interesting results there, right? Um, so in terms of elasticity, right, which we didn't see reported there, but if we used that data to calculate some elasticities, what we would find is that for higher levels of coinsurance, right? So for the full coverage and nearly full coverage group, the arc elasticity is 0.39, so a pretty high level of responsiveness compared to some other medical procedures we saw. But for the group that has less coverage, lower amounts of coverage, the responsiveness is lower. Um, which is kind of counterintuitive. The other thing we already mentioned was the dental care use differed between early experimental years and later years. So, in other words, year one and year two. And again, the intuition there is that people can sort of store up dental visits more easily than other types of care. And so people with little or no dental coverage before the experiment could basically load up on dental care early on, but then they wouldn't really need it later on in the experiment, right? So again, just to recap that, right? Um, in pretty much every single instance and in every single group, dental care in the first year was more than in the second year, right? So that we see that pretty much in every single group except for the no coverage group, right? Which is kind of not surprising. They wouldn't be able to really load up on dental care in year one, because they basically have to pay for almost all of it, right? So okay, let's see. Yeah, I think that's about it. And then in addition to dental care, we can also look at other specialized services. So um, the health insurance study also looked at prescription drug use and mental health care. Um, and price responsiveness for prescription drugs is higher than other medical services. And probably the reason for that is that there are probably lots of substitutes for prescription drugs, um, particularly in terms of lifestyle. And so, you know, we would probably expect a higher responsiveness for prescription drugs if there's more substitutes. And there's a similar thing going on with mental health care as well. Um, we would probably expect a higher responsiveness for mental care, simply because there's a lot of non-medical substitutes for mental health, right? You can go see a therapist. Um, you can go out and socialize with your friends. You can sit down and have a conversation with your spouse or your partner. Um, and so a change in price of medical care, I'm sorry, mental health care, is going to be fairly responsive because there's so many substitutes. Um, Now, initially, the health insurance study found that there was pretty small difference in responsiveness between mental health care and other types of medical care. But it turns out that that might actually be due to a design flaw. And so later on, some other um, economists sort of did a reevaluation of the original data, after correcting for the flaw in the experimental design. And once they corrected for that experimental design flaw, they actually found that the responses in price, the response to price, was larger for mental health care after correcting for those issues. Which again should be the case probably, right? In a lot of ways, mental health care is more of a luxury and less of a necessity compared to most other types of medical care. So we're going to look at that reanalyzation. And this was done by the same guy, Keeler et al., or the same group of researchers. Um, and so what they found after correcting for the experimental design flaw is that those with full coverage spent about 4 times as much on mental health care as those with no coverage. And the effect of changing coinsurance rates in the higher ranges, so 25% coinsurance and higher, had larger effects than for other medical services. And just to give you details on those, a change from 0 to 25% coinsurance led to about the same response in both mental and other medical care services. But the main difference came in those higher groups. So when changing from a 50% coinsurance rate to 95%, the result in response was twice as large for mental care compared to other medical services. So that's where the big difference is coming is in those groups that have a higher coinsurance rate. All right. Any questions so far? All right. So now we're going to start looking at some other elasticities other than price, although it's kind of price elasticity. But So now we're going to start by thinking about the effects of deductible, right? So something interesting, although insurance study didn't explicitly alter deductibles, except for in that one, the ambulatory care deductible, um, it allowed for a simulation of deductible changes, which is cool. Um, so even though they were not actually tested, we could actually simulate um, the effects of differences in deductibles. So, for example, we can simulate the effects of a increase in deductible from $100 to $500, given a 25% coinsurance rate. So this was not a group that existed, right? There was a group that had 25% coinsurance, but there was no deductible. But we can simulate a deductible, and I think this had to do with uh, the the what was it called? The incentive payment, right? The payment that covered people's maximum loss, because it depended on family income, right? And so those differing payments were basically provided a way to estimate different deductibles. And theory, if we look to theory, we would expect that higher deductibles lead to lower expenditures, since it effectively increases the cost of medical care, right? And so if you'll recall, I kind of wish I put this graph in this slide, but if you can recall back to um, the graph of different levels of illness and the different demands with regard to different levels of illness, and then there was that sort of kinked price. So uh, the price is full cost up until the deductible, and then you drop to the lower coinsurance rate. So it was kind of that step function, right? Um, that's what we're talking about here. And the results of this simulation are in table 5.6. So let's take a look at that. Okay. So again, keep in mind, this is simulated, right? So nowhere in this study were there groups that had these different deductibles. These are completely simulated. But despite the fact that they're simulated, the results are what we would expect given what we learned from theory, right? Those with lower deductibles spend less, right? Because the price is effectively lower if you don't have a deductible. And as the deductible goes up, the amount of care goes down, right? The expenditures go down. And that's pretty much true in all of these categories. Let's see, are there any categories where that's not true? No. Yeah, so that pattern holds for all of these different categories: hospital care, acute care, wellness care, chronic care, and total expenditures. Let's see here. Um, let's see. Yeah, I guess there's nothing else really to note there. But that these results totally support the theoretical prediction. So again, we're seeing evidence that supports the theories that we developed in chapter 4. And just like what we have been doing so far with price elasticities, we can also calculate an elasticity for changes in deductible. And so if we did that, we would find that the elasticity of total expenses with respect to deductible is 0.07 for hospital expenses, or I'm sorry, for total expenses, and then for hospital expenses, it's 0.4. Now, something interesting to note is that hospital care, there's not much of a change in response for hospital care until the deductible reaches $500. So let's go back and take a look at that. So hospital care, yeah, there's not much of a response there's not much of a change in response until after $500. So you can see that, we've got 400, 387, 384, 379, 376. These numbers are pretty close to each other. But once we surpass that $500 deductible, that's when the response really changes a lot, right? Nearly $100 there. Something else to note from the results is that acute care use falls off rapidly with the first small deductible increase, and then it smoothly drops off after that. And then total ambulatory care use, that should be use, not us, is near the level of an uninsured person once the deductible is $500. So just those are just some other points of interest there. So results that support the theory as far as deductibles go. What about income, right? We had some predictions on the effects of income, right? Um, and this 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 these results come from those regressions, right? So regressing the results on other variables of interest like income and age and all those sorts of things, right? Um, so of course the study collected data on people's incomes, and so we can look at the effect of income here. And in general, there is a small positive effect of income on medical care use, with one exception, and that's hospital admissions. And the results show an interesting sort of U-shaped pattern of use. So with hospital admissions, there's high use among low and high incomes and lower use among middle incomes. So a U-shaped sort of curve. And these results are in table 5.7. But a quick summary result is that the income elasticity of demand for medical care is 0.2 or less. Okay. Um, so before we go any further, let's refresh our memories on how income elasticity works, right? Because it's a little bit different than price elasticity. So can anyone tell me what it means to say that the income elasticity here is positive and not negative? What does that mean? Okay, so this elasticity, right, the income elasticity is telling us about how quantity demanded responds to a change in income, right? So those are the two things we're comparing. And since it's positive, it means they move in the same direction, right? So what type of good is medical care? Can anyone tell me that? Normal or inferior? I'll give you the two. Is it a normal good or inferior?
Normal.
Normal, yeah, right. So that's what the positive value is telling us, is that it's a normal good, and that when incomes go up, medical care use goes up. If incomes go down, medical care use goes down. So that's what the fact that it's positive is telling us, and the fact that it's so low is telling us that the response is pretty small, right? So even though somebody's income might go up, they're not going to consume that much more medical care, right? The response is pretty low. Okay, so let's take a look at these numbers. All right, so we've got income elasticity per episode of illness for different types of care. So acute, chronic, well care, dental, and hospital. And like we said, the response is pretty low, right? Pretty close to zero, although positive. So these are normal goods. And unfortunately, the elasticity for hospitals couldn't be measured. It's not statistically significant. So basically, as far as we know, it's zero for hospitals. So no response whatsoever. Now, something we have to keep in mind here when we're looking at income, okay? Um, this study was done in a pretty short amount of time, and so medical technology is essentially constant. There was probably some progress over the 3 or 5 years, but not much, right? But as income increases, so does the demand for new medical technologies. And furthermore, as technology changes, so do patterns of use and amounts of use, right? Because if a new technology comes out, then that could be a substitute or a complement for some other type of care, right? So that the changes in technology is going to affect patterns and amounts of use of other types of existing care. And so, if we really want to get at the effects of the importance of technological change, we really need a time series study, right? Something that looks at these things over many, many years, so that we can also include the effects of technological change. And so, unfortunately, the health insurance study wasn't able to do that, but there have been studies since the health insurance study that have done this, and the main result is that income elasticities are larger once we account for technological change. All right, another way we can look at effects on demand is through age and gender. Now, we had a pretty clear prediction on the effects of age, right? As people get older, their body wears out and they need more medical care, right? Because older people get sicker, and they also utilize medical care more frequently. So that shouldn't be surprising. That's what we should expect. But the effects of gender are a bit more complex, right? So looking at the differences between men and women, right? Um, and I don't even know, I don't even know if gender is technically the right term anymore. What would it be? Gender assigned at birth or something like that, right? That's really what we're talking about. Biological differences, right? Not differences in identity. And of course, a lot of the difference is coming from childbearing effects, right? Women. But those effects are predominantly going to be contained in the childbearing age range, somewhere between 19 and 44. So those effects definitely come out. Women in this age range, on average, spend more on medical care because they're getting pregnant, right, and having children. Um, but if we look at age groups beyond the childbearing age range, females actually have a slightly lower hospitalization rate than males, and that's probably not surprising, right? We can think about several things going on here. Women tend to live longer, so for a given age, women are biologically younger, right? So if you compare a 50-year-old man and a 50-year-old woman, the woman is biologically younger because that women have on average longer life expectancies. There's also some interesting patterns of ambulatory care use, but we see the opposite effects here. So females use ambulatory care more than males. And again, ambulatory care just means outpatient care. So going to see a primary care physician or something like that. And this pattern of ambulatory care use is true for all age ranges, including childbearing ages. And the same patterns also appear for prescription drug use. So females tend to use more prescription drugs than men. And we can see all of these effects in table 5.8. So let's take a look at that. All right, so here we've got different types of care broken out between men and women, and then also broken out for different age ranges. So if we're looking at hospital discharges for women, for people under 18, men are slightly more are using hospital use slightly more, and that's probably due to the fact that like young men are more rambunctious and like out getting injured more frequently than girls. That's just my rough guess. There might be other reasons for that. But then once we get into this age where women are bearing children, we see that hospital use really shoots up among women, right? Not surprisingly. But then once we pass the childbearing age range, it looks more equal, right? We get back to a more equal playing field. Although women are using hospitals slightly less than men, and again, that's probably due to the fact that um, women have longer life expectancy, so they're slightly healthier given the same age, right? Then we can look at ambulatory visits, almost identical for people under the age of 18. But then once women hit the childbearing age range, their visits shoot up. So this would be like visits to maybe the gynecologist or a paternity specialist. Um, but then that doesn't seem to decrease in this age range, which is kind of interesting. I'm a little bit curious about that. So this probably has to do with the fact that women visit gynecologists and men don't. And on top of that, with a lot of insurance plans, women have to go to a primary care physician before they go to a specialist. So if they want to go to the gynecologist, they first have to go to a primary care physician. So that's probably what's accounting for the larger ambulatory visits for women compared to men. And then lastly, looking at prescription drug use, this is in the past month and it's as a percent, reported as a percentage. So um, for young people, we see that men under the age of 18 are using slightly more prescription drugs than women, but then beyond that age, women use more prescription drugs than men. And I'm not exactly sure why. Um, but in any case, all of these differences that we're seeing in gender are partly biological, right? So the childbearing and the longer life expectancy in females, but it's also partially cultural, and that this has to do with some of the sort of structural um, institutions, right? The fact that women have to go maybe see a primary care physician before seeing a specialist, such as a gynecologist. So um, there also might be other things too regarding culture, right? Men are tough and, no, I'm fine. I don't need to go to the doctor. And women are probably more open to going to the doctor. So things like that are happening as well. All right, let's see. So it looks like we're out of time. So that's as far as we're going to get today. Um, but we'll pick up here from here next time on Monday. And hopefully Monday we'll get all the way through this. But just to remind you, so this is new material. This will not be on exam 1. This material will be on exam 2. Yeah, so I think that's all I have for you. Are there any questions before we go? Okay, cool. All right. Well, you guys have a good week and have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Bye.